The rain poured relentlessly that night, blurring the city lights into a smear of silver and sorrow. Inside a tiny cafe tucked between two tall office buildings, a young woman sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she could barely afford. Her name was Emma Clark, a single mother of a 6-year-old boy named Noah. Life hadn't been kind to her lately. Her husband, a construction worker, had died in an accident 2 years ago, and since then, every sunrise had been a battle to survive. The job she had at the grocery store barely covered rent, and most nights dinner was just scrambled eggs and bread. Still, she smiled. For Noah. Because for him, she had to be brave, even when the world felt cruel. That night, the cafe was nearly empty. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and wet asphalt. Emma had stopped by after her shift to warm up before walking home in the rain. Her old coat was soaked at the edges, and her shoes squeaked faintly against the tiled floor. As she took a sip, her eyes drifted to the counter where a man stood, tall, drenched, and clearly distressed. He searched through his pockets frantically, pulling out soaked bills that fell apart in his hands. The barista looked annoyed. The man's voice cracked slightly as he said he'd lost his wallet somewhere in the rain. The few people around looked away, pretending not to hear. The barista sighed and started to push the cup of coffee aside. And in that split second, something inside Emma moved, an impulse she couldn't explain. Maybe it was because she knew what it felt like to be embarrassed, to be desperate in front of strangers. Without thinking twice, she stood up, walked to the counter, and said softly, "I'll pay for his coffee. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of good hearts, then please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story, because what happened next will remind you that compassion can change lives in ways we can't imagine." The barista looked surprised, but nodded. Emma handed over a few crumpled bills, money she had planned to save for Noah's school lunch the next day. The man turned toward her, water dripping from his hair, and gave her a tired but grateful smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice was deep but gentle. "You didn't have to." Emma simply smiled back and said, "We all need a little help sometimes." She didn't know his name. She didn't ask. After all, it was just a cup of coffee, a small act of kindness in a world that rarely gave any back. When she finally walked home through the rain, her worn-out umbrella flipped inside out twice, and by the time she reached their small rented house on the edge of town, she was soaked to the bone. She tucked Noah into bed, kissed his forehead, and told him stories about brave people who helped others. She didn't mention the man or the coffee. It didn't seem important, but life has a strange way of taking the smallest acts and turning them into miracles. The next morning, Emma was awakened by a thunderous sound outside her window. At first she thought it was a storm, but when she peeked through the curtains, her heart nearly stopped. A helicopter was landing right in front of her tiny house, whipping up clouds of dust and leaves. She shielded her face from the wind as the door opened, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out. Her neighbors peeked out from their windows, whispering in shock. Noah ran to her side, clutching her arm. "Mom, what's happening?" he asked in fear. Emma's heart pounded as one of the men approached her. He smiled politely and said, "Ma'am, are you Emma Clark?" She nodded hesitantly. He handed her a sealed envelope and said, "Mr. Donovan asked us to give this to you." Before she could ask anything else, they returned to the helicopter and took off, leaving her standing in her front yard, barefoot and confused. Her fingers trembled as she tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter written in neat handwriting and a check. When her eyes fell on the number, she gasped. 500,000. She almost dropped it. The letter read, "Dear Emma, you don't know me, but last night you reminded me what humanity feels like. I was having the worst night of my life. I'd lost my wallet, my patience, and my faith in people. You didn't know who I was, yet you showed me kindness without expecting anything in return. I'm not just a man who lost his wallet. My name is James Donovan. I own Donovan Industries. You may not remember, but when I was your age, someone once helped me when I had nothing. You reminded me of that. Consider this not as payment, but as a thank you for helping me remember who I wanted to be. With gratitude, James Donovan." Emma's knees buckled. She fell onto the porch, staring at the letter in disbelief. The number looked unreal, like something out of a dream. She turned to Noah, who was staring wide-eyed. "Mom, are we rich now?" he asked innocently. Tears filled her eyes. She hugged him tightly and whispered, "No, sweetheart. We're blessed." That night she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the moonlight washing over the check on the table. She couldn't understand how one small act, a cup of coffee, could bring something so extraordinary. But more than the money, what moved her was the letter, because behind every word she could feel the sincerity of someone whose heart had been touched. Days passed, and Emma decided not to cash the check immediately. Instead, she went to the grocery store where she worked, thinking about whether she should even keep it. She felt torn, grateful, yet guilty, as if she didn't deserve it. That afternoon, a black car pulled up outside the store. A man stepped out wearing a suit, and when he removed his sunglasses, Emma froze. It was the same man from the cafe, the stranger. James Donovan. He approached her with a kind smile. "You didn't cash it," he said softly. "Why?" Emma hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. "Because I didn't do anything special," she replied. "It was just a coffee." He smiled warmly. "Exactly. It was just a coffee. But in a world where everyone looks away, you looked closer. You gave when you had nothing. That's what makes it priceless." She didn't know what to say. He told her that night he'd been on his way home from the hospital, where he had been visiting his mother, his last family. She had passed away shortly after. He'd felt lost, disconnected, and angry. "But your kindness reminded me that there are still good people out there," he said quietly. "You didn't just buy me coffee, Emma. You brought me back from the edge." She finally smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't think it mattered that much." "It always matters," he replied. Over the following months, Emma's life changed dramatically. James introduced her to a program run by his company that helped struggling single parents find stable jobs and housing. She refused to take handouts but accepted the opportunity. Within a year, she had a managerial position at one of his charity foundations. Noah was enrolled in a better school. The small house she once rented was replaced by a cozy home filled with laughter and warmth. But what never changed was Emma's humility. She still visited the same cafe every week, sitting by the window with her coffee, sometimes quietly paying for someone else's cup, just in case they needed a little kindness, too. Months later, during a company event, James spoke on stage about the importance of empathy in a world obsessed with success. His voice cracked slightly when he said, "I once met a woman who reminded me that the smallest acts of kindness can rebuild entire lives. She didn't know who I was, but because she cared, I found hope again." He turned toward the audience, where Emma sat beside Noah, smiling proudly. The crowd gave her a standing ovation, but she just lowered her head, humbled, never seeking attention. That night, as she tucked Noah into bed, he asked, "Mom, why did you help that man that day?" She smiled, brushing his hair from his forehead. "Because you never know when a small kindness might change someone's world, baby." And he nodded thoughtfully. "Like how he changed ours." She kissed his forehead. "Exactly." As she turned off the light, Emma paused by the window. The moon glowed softly over their new home. She thought of the rain, the coffee, the man who had been just a stranger once, and how everything had begun with a simple choice to care. So many of us believe we can't make a difference unless we have money, power, or influence. But Emma's story proved otherwise. One humble act, a cup of coffee, had rippled across 2 lives, 2 hearts, and countless others who now found hope through the charity James and Emma built together. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that kindness can change the world in ways we'll never fully see, please like this video, share it with someone who needs faith in humanity again, and subscribe for more stories that inspire. And before we end, tell us in the comments, have you ever helped someone without expecting anything back and later realized it meant more than you imagined? Because sometimes the smallest things we do are the ones that echo forever.